Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I was going to say it's brilliant to be back, but then nobody ever stops when you stand up when you're back. When you're doing this digitally, you don't have an audience. So I'm Kelly Beaver. I'm the Chief Executive of Ipsos in the UK and Ireland, and it's actually brilliant to be back doing this event live. Last year and the year before, we had to do it digitally down the line. This year, we do have some people joining us down the line, but the majority of you are in the room. So we have a fabulous lineup for today's event. We have a brilliant group of panelists. The plan is that I will talk you through the review of the year, what has been, and there's been quite a lot, and then also some reflections from our panelists. And with us tonight, we have Andy Haldane, who's the Chief Executive of the Royal Society for the Arts, previously from Bank of England. We have Kathryn Jacob OBE, who's the Chief Executive of Pearl and Dean. We have Torsten Bell, who's the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, and the Right Honourable, the Baroness Evans of Bowes Park, who served as the leader of the House of Lords until the 6th of September this year, which means she served under both Boris Johnson and Theresa May. So she will have some fabulous anecdotes for us. And then we have Kamal Ahmed as well, who is the Editor-in-Chief and co-founder of the News Movement. There will be opportunities for Q&A. In the room, you have the old-fashioned Q&A. You put your hand in the air, you ask the question. If you're down the line, please just pop it into the right-hand side of the chat box, and we will definitely try to get a nice range of questions from everybody who is watching today. If you want to tweet, it's hashtag Ipsos 2022. So 2022, I thought I would be coming here this year and talking to you mostly about what it was like to return from a pandemic where we were mostly in solitude. But actually, there have been lots of other highs and lows this year. We have had some of the best highs with the Lionesses bringing home fabulous cup. We've had Matt Hancock in the jungle. That was a high for me, watching him eat some of the horrific things that we got to watch him eat. But there have also been some quite desperate lows. We have war in Ukraine, and we also had the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. So it has been a year of ups and downs. And if you look at the Wikipedia page on 2022, it's already a third longer than it was in 2021. And we're not done yet. We've got 3 weeks left this year. And Mick Lynch has plenty more ahead in store for us. In fact, we know that we will be having a lot of disruption as we go into the Christmas weeks and just outside of the Christmas weeks in early January as well. We will have strikes of our postal workers, of our rail workers, and also of our health workers. And the public are sympathetic. They are mostly sympathetic with the passengers, actually, for the rail disruption. And I concur. But they do have a level of sympathies with the unions, and they do have a level of sympathy with the railway workers as well. So there's plenty more to come this year. And the turbulence we have experienced, it has been like a roller coaster for the British public, and they have not enjoyed the ride. 9 in 10 say that they think that this was a bad year for Britain, and we carry out this study across 36 countries around the globe. We're not on our own, but we are the worst. Most others are saying around 3 in 4 people in other countries around the world believe that their country has had a bad year. And if I cast your minds back to what was happening at the beginning of this very year, we were actually dealing with the Omicron virus. I bet you that seems like it was a lifetime ago. It wasn't. We were still very, very concerned with COVID-19. This is some data from our Issues Index, which has been working to look at spontaneous concern amongst the British public since 1974. And you can just see that this was the highest concern back in January, February this year. We weren't back in the workplace yet. We were still working fully remotely at Ipsos. By the time we got to September, COVID-19 was a distant memory for many in the public. Only 1% said it was the top issue facing Britain today. And why is that? Well, it did abate, but also other issues were really starting to rise to the fore. Concern about inflation has risen 6-fold since the beginning of this year. And it has broadened beyond concern about inflation. We're now also very concerned about the state of the economy. And back in March, as we started to subside from the COVID pandemic, concern rose for defence and foreign affairs. You know what that was related to. That was war in Ukraine. And actually it was the highest that we'd seen this level of concern since the Iraq war as well. and our issues index, we had to reactivate one of the codes that we had deactivated, which was public concern about nuclear war. 1 in 10 around that same time started to become worried about the concept of nuclear war. So it's been a turbulent year, but one thing hasn't shifted. These are the proportions of the public who were watching and constantly looking for news and information on the cost of living crisis. And this has remained quite stable over the course of 2022. 87% of people are still really worried and they are looking for information on cost of living. And this isn't surprising. It's not surprising because we see the impacts of it quite universally across our society. And it's also not limited to income groups. You see 9 in 10 people say that they've experienced increases in the price of their food shopping, similar proportions in the increase of their cost of their utilities, and again, very high proportions who are seeing an increase in fuel and transportation. And it's not just all income groups, it's also, this isn't an out of work crisis, because our polling tells us, as does the ONS data, that only a very small proportion of households, 1 in 20, have had any kind of unemployment experience in the last year in their households. And the ONS data concurs, as does our own issues index, where we have a 50-year low on concern about unemployment. So where does this leave the public? Well, they are Arctic on the economy. We see some of our highest levels of concern. 8 in 10 think the economy's poor, and even though our Chancellor in the November budget managed to quell the concerns of the markets, he didn't quell the concerns of the British public. Almost half say they're still concerned, more concerned about their own financial situation following on from that November budget. Only 1 in 5 say they were actually reassured as a result of it. And one of the most telling statistics on the economy is who people trust on managing the economy. This is a Conservative mainstay, but now Labour 6 points ahead on managing the economy. But of course, they don't really trust anybody on it. So what do we do when we have mass concern, lots of turbulence? We look for somebody to blame. So who do the British public blame? It's actually our government and our own national policies, and this is different in terms of who we consider to be to blame comparatively to other countries around the world. In other countries, the top answer here is the war in Ukraine. It's the coming out of the global pandemic. It's actually a global economic issue. In the UK, we see much more closer to home about our own government and national policies. Which brings me to an attempt to explain what has happened in politics over the last year. Hold on in there, wish me luck. So, I'm going to start with some perishable items. We have had 3 prime ministers, one of which has been outlasted by a lettuce, and also less popular than the lettuce. I love lettuce on my salad, but unfortunately, Liz Truss was the shortest office holder in that particular position since it began. But she's not the only one who has been rotated in government over the last period. So I believe FIFA allow 5 substitutes now. Well, the Conservative Party are delighted to hear that because they have had 5 substitutes, 5 Secretaries of State in education, 4 in levelling up, 4 in health, and of course 3 prime ministers. The one good thing about some of that rotation is they've actually had some of the most diversity in the cabinet than we have ever seen in the history of politics. But don't think for a second the public haven't noticed the political disruption, because you can see it loud and clear in their voting intention. In our latest Political Monitor poll, there was a 20-point gap between Labour and the Conservatives, with Labour in the lead quite substantively. Some of the more recent polling, we have a new one coming out next week, as soon as possible, Gideon Skinner, our head of politics. But some of the more recent polling does show that gap start to narrow, but it will not close without a significant change. And why is that? Well, it's because it's really underlying now with the Conservative Party brand. Good news for Conservatives is that when we ask about favourability of their brand, they're winning on 5 things. Bad news for the Conservatives is they're winning on 5 things you don't want to win on. They're winning on, will promise anything to win votes, being perceived to be divided, out of date and extreme. And Labour now have taken the lead on some of those, again, previously Conservative mainstays of being perceived as fit to govern, keeping their promises, having a good team of leaders. And actually, one of the substitutes may be doing quite well so far. Rishi Sunak currently leads Keir Starmer on being perceived as having what it takes to be a good Prime Minister. He may, we don't know, prove to be one of the best subs they've had yet. But beyond politics, there have been quite a few constitutional matters to deal with. We now have new pronouns in our national anthem. We have KCs as barristers instead of QCs. And we have a new face coming to a coin near you, one which is turned to a different direction, and you'll note some changes. There isn't a crown. And of course, I'm talking about the change in our monarchy over the last 12 months. And we have some really interesting and good polling on the monarchy. Actually, you can have a look at it on our website. But at the point of the Platinum Jubilee earlier this year, the Queen, who has been a mainstay of stability and tradition in the country, was polling at 9 in 10 in the British public who were satisfied that she was doing a really good job. Politicians would kill for that kind of rating. And our Ipsos Iris capability, which allows us to passively measure online digital behaviours, allowed us to see what was happening online over that period. And it was a really important media point around the point of the Queen's passing, but also her funeral. We saw 20% of the entire population go on to the BBC News app on the 8th of September. And we also saw a huge increase between July and September in the number of people who were visiting royal.uk. 5 million people visited that website since in that point in September. And as King Charles takes on his reign, he too is starting to poll with very great expectations. Now 9 in 10 believe he will do a good job. That is up substantively since we polled it in June. So what will history make of 2022? Well, I think it will be quite a marked year, actually, because of the scale of events and change that we have seen in politics, the economy, and other major constitutional events like that I just mentioned. But actually, at Ipsos, we often say, you think things are changing really, really fast, but they're not. But there have been, and we have identified some changes. Some of these are about our attitudes and behaviours, which change, as we know, more frequently and faster than our underlying value set. And our Global Trends survey, which will be launched early in January this year, has started to show even shifts in some of those core, longer-stayed values. But first, on the behaviours and attitudes. Coming out of the back of COVID, which I told you I thought I would talk a lot about today, we thought we would be back more fully, socially, face-to-face. Actually, the more recent polling that we have shows that people believe now that some of these trends have stuck from COVID. They are spending more time actually looking at their screens than they did before the pandemic. Half of people believe that's the case. And also 3 in 10 believe that they are seeing their family and friends less, and also they're leaving their homes less. So some of this has stuck. But also one of the major trends that we've been watching through Ipsos Carrion and Box, which is our employee experience capability, is how are people working? How and where are they working? And we know this is one of the massive office taboos. I know this more than most perhaps, but actually office workers want to work in a hybrid way, or they want to work at home all the time. We know that how office workers have the ability to work from, that this is not every occupation that allows this, but if you look at the office specifically. Our Captains of Industry study, which looks at what chief executives want, tells a slightly different picture. So 7 in 10, again, believe hybrid working is how staff will want to work, but a quarter think that they will expect staff to work fully in the office, and a very small proportion believe staff will be working completely from home. So there are differences in opinion here, which will need to come out to bear as the years go on, but ultimately also this 7 in 10 does not mean that CEOs and the employee base are thinking hybrid means exactly the same thing. So that means different things to different people. So those are some of the behaviours and attitudes that we have seen as a result of the pandemic change. But what about our values? And this is some data from the upcoming, you're getting a sneak peek to the upcoming Global Trends data. The key things that we have seen move on are about the pace of life and the need for nostalgia. This particular statement, I wish I could slow down the pace of my life, has risen 10 points over the last 3 years alone. We don't see values change that quickly, so that is quite substantive. The other is I would like Britain to be the way it used to be. And in times of change and turbulence and uncertainty, we do often see a reach for nostalgia for the things of the past. And here again, we have 6 in 10 in the British public who want things to be the way they used to be. We see this come through in other parts of our data as well, with 2 in 5 people saying that they think young people today will have a worse life than their parents did. So this is corroborated in other ways. Another thing that hasn't really changed is trust. Apparently, we as British people, we're quite trusting when you compare us to others globally. And we saw in our Veracity Index, which compares trustworthiness, people's perceived trustworthiness for different types of profession, we saw that the ranking and the ordering didn't move too much, but it was a very good year for newsreaders as they bounced out of the pandemic. Trade union officials did quite well, and as did engineers. Those that did less well, these are not going to be surprises. Politicians, but they were already one of the least trusted of the professions that we test in the Veracity Index, but also leaking through to local councillors as well, which often poll a little bit better. So for the ad executives in the room, I have a little bit of Christmas cheer. You're now better. You used to be bottom, you're now better than politicians. So and also for the civil servants in the room, actually we've seen some of the really significant movement since we started polling the Veracity Index in 1983, a clear 30-point improvement for civil servants. So lots of good news in the Veracity Index for some of you in the room too. Some of the other things that we haven't seen really be impacted by either the financial situation we find ourselves very worried about today, or indeed the pandemic, is our commitment to the environment. That is a mainstay, and that is a core part of British values today. We are heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. 8 in 10 people agree. And finally, also our commitment to diversity and representation. In the Captains of Industry study, which looks at what CEOs think about key issues, 8 in 10 say that they agree that they actively promote diversity and inclusion amongst their organisations. Of course, the British public have a view. 5 in 10 say that gender inequalities are still widespread in Britain, irrespective of that hope. And also, even more think this is the case in the workplace. And there are still parts of public-facing sectors and roles where there are still issues that are highlighted by some of our data as well. Older people, LGBTQ+ groups feel less represented across film, TV, news magazines, etc. So it has been quite a year of change. And actually, we have seen and experienced multiple interlinked crises, which you will have heard the term polycrises, but that is the experience of the British people this year. And it has impacted on the public mood, and we see that coming through in our data. We have had a rapid rotation in politics, but also a number of things that have fundamentally dented trust in politicians, even beyond the low point that they were already at in our Veracity Index. There is still a long way to go to 2024, but that is a very, very big gap. But we also know a week is a lifetime in politics, no more so than it has been this year in particular. And then finally, we've had a few years of relative stability in our values, behaviours, etc., as we went through that pandemic and even before on the values. And what we're starting to see now is that there is change. There's change in the extent to which we are digital, flexible, progressive in some of our views, but also, as a result of the turbulence around us, we are really seeking some sense of stability, security, and reassurance. So what does 2023 hold? Well, for the majority of the public, 53%, I can just about say majority, they think it's going to be better than 2022, but there's a lot of trepidation, and we see that coming across in our data. And in fact, this year has been challenging. Next year is likely to be perhaps more challenging as we face into headwinds. And as a result of that, and the fact that this is a crisis of multiple interlinking issues, we will need to support our families, our colleagues, our society. And so perhaps the question we should ask ourselves as people, as senior professionals in our industries, as perhaps people who work in political life, and thinking a little bit about how we can spread a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism, and perhaps a little bit more kindness as we go into what will be a challenging year ahead. Thank you very much. panellists up to the stage, and we will hear from each of them their reflections on the year that has been, and perhaps I will push them for something optimistic. So if you want to go up the step and walk from Andy, you come to me. There we go. Brilliant, you're next to me. Yeah, that should be us. Oh, where do you want me?
I'm just got water.
In the middle, Kelly, or do you want the side?
Oh, right, okay, I'll go in the middle. Sorry, I'll sit on the wet seat. That's fine.
It's my fault.
You're going to go up the
Right.
Trousers are waterproof, don't worry. So, okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So we're going to give each of our panellists about 5 minutes now, just to talk a little bit about what they took from it, perhaps, and any reflections. And we will start with yourself, Andy.
Thank you, Kelly, for that. Afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all. I'm here staring at a picture of myself, actually.
Yes, so it's very disconcerting.
Which was January. That was January. This is me now. It's been a tough year. I'm an economist, and when we're just, I know that wasn't the news. But when we're describing the economy, we often like to assign a letter of the alphabet to it, like a W or a U or an N or a V. There is no letter of the alphabet that describes the economy this year, I think it's fair to say. Although Torsten may have one, we'll see. So I think physical objects that might describe this year. And I instantly went for roller coaster, except for the fact, of course, that roller coasters go up as well as down. And this year has not been that. It has been more of a slide than a roller coaster, with a bit of a bungee jump put in around the time of the mini budget.
Yes.
And at the top of the slide, at the top of the year, I mean, it feels like a long time ago, but things then were realistically set to improve a bit. Right? We were expecting decent-ish growth. We're expecting inflation to be a bit above its target, but not loads above its target. We were expecting, hoping, I guess, the COVID crisis would abate. Of course, the last of those things did happen, at least as well as we expected. But the first two, assuredly, did not, because other things got in the way. And those other things were, of course, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Although, truth be told, the seeds of the cost of living problems that have become a lot more acute over the course of this year were sown well before this year. They were sown back in at least 2021 and then amplified by the events of this year. The upshot of which is that growth I mentioned has largely been extinguished, and that inflation I mentioned, as you all know, has now hit double digits. And those largely but not exclusively global headwinds have, of course, been compounded then by political uncertainties at home. So the macro and the political have interacted in negative ways, particularly in the second half of the year, but actually picking up pace since around the spring. And that really has kicked the legs out of the recovery and has led to that situation that Kelly mentioned a few minutes ago of most people ranking this as being a pretty terrible year at the end point relative to at the start point. You mentioned the word polycrisis. It is certainly that, because it has both macro and political and social and health roots and a few more besides, which we might get on to. But there's also a sense in which it's a bit of a permacrisis, because none of those uncertainties are likely anytime soon to abate. The numbers for what they're worth, the macro forecasts for next year are no better, or not much better, if any, than they have been for this year. It looks like a year of recession. It looks like a year when household incomes, which I'm sure Torsten will mention, will be sliced very materially. It looks like a year where inflation will still be multiples of its target. And inevitably, given that we're all riddled with behavioural biases, you see that pessimism bias, the catastrophizing already kicking in. So I thought to end, Kelly, then.
Something optimistic.
Yeah. So far, so good, right? Enjoying it?
There's fire inside.
I'm going to ask the question, which I'm understood to believe that the venture capital company, Sequoia Capital, asks itself at every morning meeting, which is meant to be an antidote to our inbuilt pessimism bias, which is particularly acute right now. And the question is, what could go right? Because the nature of uncertainty is that it's meant to have two sides, right? An upper tail and a lower tail. Our instinctive bias is towards exploring in some detail the lower tail. So forcing yourself to examine the upper tail is quite a helpful thing, not least because the upper tail might even become self-fulfilling. Who might knew? So to end with two notes of optimism. One, think local. We're in a situation where actually there's much, much, much more stability in local politics than there is in national politics. And what I see when I travel around the country right now, which I'm doing, is that lots of local leaders are just getting on with it. They are not feeling frozen by the uncertainty. They're just getting on with it. If you're waiting for that uncertainty to resolve itself, you'll be waiting a hell of a long time. And they are forging ahead, empowered to some degree, and I hope in future are empowered to an even greater degree. You'll have seen Gordon Brown's report on just that question published earlier this year. Second point, second optimistic note, is that it is true that uncertainty can also freeze companies, and indeed many companies are frozen by that uncertainty, but not all of them. The bigger ones, protecting their assets, tend to go to ground. But for smaller companies, with less to lose if you like, uncertainty equals opportunity. If you look at the investment numbers across different companies of different sizes and sectors, there is, among some, investment and innovation and risk-taking taking place. And our job as policymakers is to nurture that second cohort.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to start visioning something really positive for 2023. That's very helpful. Kathryn, over to you.
Okay, so I'm here to whisk you through entertainment in 5 minutes, which is rather difficult, but never mind. I think this is a year of transition. So for large areas of entertainment, theatre, concerts, cinema, we had a whole period where we were shut, so there was nothing in production, no audiences for you to play to, so this is our transition year. However, I can make one prediction for you with fair certainty, which is there is not a reality show that isn't now popping Matt Hancock onto their call list. So I think you can expect to see quite a lot of him popping up on your screens so people can get to know him better, apparently. So what we see is a world in transition. So throughout COVID, you had a huge amount of streaming, television, etc. And that was all going to be the future of entertainment. Actually, maybe not so much, as people are kind of changing their habits now. So we've seen a model of people like Netflix, etc., now moving to an ad-funded model because that subscription model isn't making them enough money. Because, of course, in a downturn, what you do is you look at something and think, do I really want to watch 43 episodes of Matt Hancock in X on the Beach? No, probably not. I'm not going to spend $5.99 a month watching that. So there's an interesting change there going on, which will then change the nature of the content. The nature of the content is also dictating as well, there's a huge amount of content. If you go on the EPG, you're there for 20 minutes, and in the end you end up watching something that you knew about already because it's so hard to make a choice. So the challenge that is facing content makers now is how do you build an audience? And how do you keep an audience as well? So for those of you who've been under a rock today, there is a new series out on Netflix about two people who live in Montecito. That has been trailed for so long that I literally feel I've lived that 6 episodes myself. But that's what you've got to do, is find an audience and keep that audience. And that's particularly difficult. The other thing that you've got to have is the adaptability to serve people what they want when they want it. So when people talk about the death of linear television, they're wrong. And to quote the very lovely Lindsay Clay, who runs Thinkbox, television isn't dead, it's just having babies. So what you see is a move from linear television to SVOD and BVOD. So you've seen the relaunch of ITVX, you've seen a lot of moves going on with Channel 4. So it's finding your audience and segmenting your audience properly and targeting that audience so that you can keep them and then obviously sell those eyeballs to advertisers. That's an interesting thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is that idea where you were told what you were going to watch and when, yes, that's been changed by the platforms, but also some of the content that's come out that is intensely popular are things that you would not put on as a normal broadcaster if certain platforms weren't available. Who would have thought that Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart talking to each other twice a week would be one of the top podcasts? Who would have thought that the newsagents would have been a top podcast? And it is the thing about making bite-sized, accessible content that people want for them to get to. You will find an audience. We were excited about Top Gun coming back in cinema. Would we have thought it was as popular as it was? It may go back. It may go back into the nostalgia piece because, you know, we all love Tom Cruise. But he was a man who built his audience. There's probably people here who are opening up their sheds that Tom Cruise turned up to in the effort to get people to go and watch go and watch Top Gun. There was no stone was unturned in that attempt to build an audience, and it worked. And in fact, it's back in cinemas now, just in case you didn't get to see it the first time round. So there is a huge kind of level of change going on, and yet some things are still true, which is if you make great content for the right people and you market it properly, build it and they will come. And looking forward on an optimistic note, next year, and I can only talk about my area, we have got more cinema releases than you can shake a stick at, and you will be seeing Harrison Ford coming back yet again as Indiana Jones.
Oh, wow.
And a particular source of excitement for a certain segment of my audience is the Barbie movie with Ryan Gosling as Ken. I think it's fair to say that that photo of him might have appeared on a few presentations, but there's a lot of interesting things going on. And also that audience, to the point about the high street, which we talked about, Kelly. Cinema now is smaller and on your local high street, and that's been where the real growth's been. If people aren't leaving home as much, what they will do is go out locally. So we've seen a big growth of 3 and 4 screen cinemas in areas which were probably under-screened before, and they've moved away from town centres. But anyway, Barbie, July.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you. Just to be clear on Barbie, in case some of you have children and think it's for children, it's not.
No,
it's not.
It's so not for children.
Ryan Gosling is not for tiny people. Okay, so Torsten, follow that.
I don't know how to follow Ryan Gosling and also the prospect of Matt Hancock being on all our screens 24/7. It just pushed me over the edge. And while I was watching your presentation, for lots of it, I was just thinking, who are the 13% who think 2022 wasn't bad, and what are they drinking? And then how do we get some was my core thought. My second thought was it's a lot easier to work out who the 50% who think there aren't any gender inequalities are. But anyway, I'll leave you to the half and half split of the population there. Right, politics has been complete chaos. I'm not going to touch much on that, mainly because I think for the punters, it's the economic chaos that is the key problem, and the political chaos is almost a manifestation and matters for who gets blamed for it, but isn't the key thing. The key thing for 2022, the story, is the cost of living crisis. Back in this time last year, we wrote a piece saying 2022 is going to be the year of the squeeze. We were wrong because it was much bigger. And it isn't the year. It turns out it's at least a 2-year game that we are, unfortunately, engaged in. As Andy said, it's the highest inflation in 40 years, much higher than anyone saw coming. For people, I think it's quite important because we've had quite a lot of bad years recently. And sometimes people, when I'm doing talks like this, people say, oh, okay, yes, it's a bad year, but we've had bad years before. So I think it's important to recognise like quite how bad. We're talking about like you probably all knew it was bad due to the like paying for your energy bills things, but like we're talking on most forecasts a kind of 7 to 8% income fall over this year and next. That's £1,700 for the average household. For lower income households, that's obviously all of their fun budget. That's like all of the cinema and the holiday gone. It's the kind of income falls we only normally see in very deep recessions. So not in your normal recessions, really bad recessions. That is the kind of income falls we are talking about. As Kelly said, it's not income falls coming from rising unemployment yet. I'll come back to that at the end. And that means at one level, the good news from that is it's not a concentrated set of income falls. You know, in the 1980s, we had awful income falls for some people that lost their jobs and then quite good times for lots of people who were still in work. This is not that. This is widely shared and terrible rather than concentrated and terrible. I don't know if that's good or not, but I think it's probably slightly better in terms of social cohesion. It's definitely better geographically in terms of not having some places being very concentratedly hit. Then just to step back, like why does it feel so hard that for Britain, that the country that's happening to, why does it feel so hard? And then just without giving like, you know, the total history of the last 40 years, there's just two things I think we should basically have in our head about the political economy of Britain in the 2020s, and that is we're living with the inequality of the 1980s and the low growth, the stagnation of the 2010s, of the last 15 years. And the two together are a disaster for lower middle income Britain. If you put like just one simple fact, if you put those two things together, we haven't been growing and we're really unequal. Like most of these people of us in this room, if we go and spend a bit of time in the Netherlands, we probably think, we look pretty similar to the kind of income levels of people doing our kind of jobs, which is basically broadly true, but it's only true for the top in Britain. They're the only people that are remotely like their equivalents in Northern Europe. So if you look at the poor in Britain compared to the poor in France, they are 20% poorer. It's not 2%, it's not 3%, it's not, a £5 a month, it's 20% poorer. And that is why when we, like lots of European countries, are being hit by this cost of living crisis, which as Andy says is largely, at least in the short term, driven by international factors, we can't cope. I'll give you another quick fact to highlight that. In the 2000s, poorer Britain spent 52%, just less than 52% of their income on essentials. Food, housing, energy, the things you can't really cut easily, okay? It went up to 58% before the crisis. So a big increase in the percentage of people's budgets going on essentials. That's what happens when you get poorer and you're a very unequal country. And that's why it feels so tough when we then get hit by this year. Now, on 2023, it's quite hard, obviously, to make any predictions. Really I've got some perkiness that coming. This isn't the perk. You get in 2023, then the perk.
Okay.
The perk may be ambiguous, depending on your perspective. But on 2023, I think there's a number of things. I can start with the optimism if you want, which is that we probably won't do as much stupid stuff, because the politicians have slightly learned the lesson that doing really stupid stuff doesn't work quite as well unless you're the lettuce. Right. So I think we might get less of that, although we'll come on to that shortly. Secondly, for economists, lots of the things that have been causing the imported bits of this inflation, okay, so for example, that the Yanks just keep buying everything in the entire planet and pushing up the price of it around the world. You know, they keep buying recreational goods. I don't know what they're doing with and that doesn't mean drugs, okay? It means like sports and arts kit, okay? They keep buying it, it pushes up the price, we're paying that. Freight costs have gone through the roof, and energy obviously has gone through the roof. All of those are now coming down from the highs we were used to. So the imported bit of inflation broadly is looking good and is consistent with fast-ish falls of inflation over the course of the year ahead. So that's the good news for economists. The problem is for punters. It's obviously, there's two things. One is it's the price level that matters, not the rate of inflation, i.e. the fact that you're not getting any poorer doesn't make you feel much better. The second thing is you are going to be getting poorer because we haven't hit bottom yet. Energy bills will go up from their current £2,500 level to £3,000 in April, and the level of government support is coming down by about 2/3 next year. So the heat of the income hit is ahead of us, even if the bit that economists were worried about is behind us, and that is going to be a difficult situation where the public's not going to want to hear the Governor of the Bank of England saying, good news, it's getting better, at the point at which things are getting worse for them. And then if the rising unemployment happens, which is what's in most forecasts now, then that is definitely ahead of us. So the perk. The first one, which as I just said, is we've got poorer as a country. Okay, that's what's happened. We've got poorer as a country. Most of that is because the stuff we buy from around the world has become more expensive for us, and the stuff we produce they don't want very much, right? So we're getting poorer as a country. So the decision we have is about how we bear the pain, okay? And if you step back from all the chaos of this year, and there's been lots of roller coasters on this policy choices, but the big picture choice we have made is in relative terms to protect poorer households. Like, you've had a Conservative government which has confirmed it's going ahead with the largest increase in benefits next April, at least since the early 90s, possibly on record depending on how you, with a 10% increase, okay, at the same time as pushing up taxes on higher income households. That is literally what the Social Democrat textbook says you should do when an energy price shock happens. And yes, they tried hard not to do it, but in the end, they have actually done it. And that is going to make a big difference. If all of our forecasts for next year's income is big income falls, for big income falls for better off Britain next year. Really big, I'm afraid. Tax rises, energy bills a lot. For poorer households, the impact is worse, so let's not pretend that's not worse, but the policy is actually making them less severe for poorer households. And that is the right thing for us to be doing as a society in really tough times. So that's good news. The second bit of good news is that if Christmas gets cancelled, I'd rather it got cancelled by strikes than COVID.
Okay, good. So, Merry Christmas from Torsten. So now I turn to the Right Honourable Baroness Evans of Bowes Park. Natalie?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where do you start talking about politics this year? It's very hard to know. But as Kelly said, I was Leader of the House of Lords and a member of the Cabinet for the last 6 years. And my time in government coincided with Brexit, with COVID, and the outbreak of war in Ukraine. So as far as I was concerned, they were pretty challenging years that I had to navigate some very difficult and choppy waters. But I think even I would accept that the political turbulence that we've seen this year has been pretty much something else. And that's saying, someone who has been through interminable months and months of deadlock and political battles over Brexit, and of course dealing with the impact of COVID, which we've all talked about was so extreme for everybody. So over 6 years I worked for 2 prime ministers, as Kelly said. This year we've had 3. And it is actually quite hard to believe that next Monday is in fact only 3 years since that emphatic 2019 general election result, which, to be honest, I hadn't really realised until I sort of started thinking about speaking today. And I mean, frankly, who would have thought, or even, who could ever have predicted what has happened since then? But I do think we are perhaps going to see a bit of a change in style in politics. I think we've already slightly started to see it, and I think that will continue into next year and beyond. Because basically our politics over the last few years has really been dominated by big personalities. Obviously we have Boris and his presidential approach to being Prime Minister, rooted in his view that the 2019 election was a sort of mandate for him personally rather than the Conservative Party. We obviously had Jeremy Corbyn and his very devoted following. And then we had Liz Truss this summer, very, cultivating her Instagram image, and very much during the election campaign making herself the warrior against the status quo. I think we now might be moving into a somewhat different phase from individuals to issues. And there are several reasons for that. One of them obviously being actually the people who are now at the top of our main political parties. So I think that's very much Rishi's approach. He's not sort of a showman, he gets on with things, and that was part of his pitch over the summer, which wasn't successful then, but I think perhaps chimes in a bit more now. And I think that's really been Keir Starmer's approach ever since he's been leader of the Labour Party. I think that approach chimes in with just the general public mood that, frankly, we've had enough drama and we just want to get on with things. And I mean, as we've all heard, and I'm not going to deny, the huge challenges we're facing both internationally and domestically. With the economic uncertainty we've heard about, with the cost of living issues affecting pretty much everyone in the country, and of course, the challenges facing our public services. I do think we are, as I say, have seen, but I think we'll see into next year a shift from sort of personalities to policy and to sort of the politics of the everyday, which I think is probably quite a good thing. I think one of the other things we've seen, although it may seem slightly counterintuitive to say, is we have once again seen the ruthlessness and survival instinct of Conservative MPs. They've looked over the precipice a couple of times this year, and on both occasions have wanted to step back and have got rid of, as we've said, 2 prime ministers. And, you know, they have acted as, I think, you know, lots of people say Conservative MPs do, but they have acted when they needed to do so at certain points in the year. And I'm sure this will get a laugh. It's not supposed to be funny, but it is actually calmer in Parliament at the moment than it has been for most of the year. And while that sort of might sound slightly amusing, actually that in itself is quite an achievement because we have had points this year where the atmosphere has been incredibly febrile. And actually I think, you know, as things move on, and as I say, I think this bit shift of sort of the style of politics that I think we're going to see going forward has been quite significant, and I think is important. As we heard, obviously, from Kelly's presentation, it hasn't just been momentous political events this year, it's been, frankly, momentous national events. Obviously, the joy in the summer and the great time we all had in the Jubilee, and then, obviously, the very sad passing of Her Majesty the Queen not that long ago. And as I reflect back on my time as Leader of the House of Lords, most of my God, I can't just believe this is happening to me moments, I have to say, did happen with Her Majesty the Queen. In the role of Leader of the House of Lords, you get to do things I mean, frankly, I didn't even know existed. You know, state banquets, having a drink with the Queen and Donald Trump is something that I shall remember forever. You know, garden parties, being involved in Privy Council meetings, and in fact being at the first Zoom Privy Council meeting that we had to have, obviously at the beginning of the lockdown, and seeing the Queen beamed into Cobra from her nice comfy chair in Windsor Castle. Incredible things that we've done, and also kind of remembering the fantastic service that she gave to us all in this country. So 2023, I think my optimism is that we will have less political psychodrama, which I hope you can all agree will only be a good thing.
Well, thank you very much. And now, to complete the set, Kamal.
Thank you so much, Kelly. What an interesting conversation it's been. Andy, I'm going to start over with you. So I learnt a lesson from one of my mentors many years ago, that on your way home, do not think of the 10 things that have gone wrong today, but the 3 things that went well. And I think that's something close to the Sequoia statement. Something, Kelly, you and I have spoken about, and it's something to do with my new business called the News Movement, is around this is not the same experience for all demographics. Torsten, you've touched on it in terms of income. We are obsessed with actually what we think is the most important trend that is happening beyond all the choppy waves of inflation. And is China going to continue to be a net exporter of inflation rather than the net exporter of deflation that it has been since the financial crisis? Climate change, this year we are going to burn as much coal as we did in 2013. We know there are lots and lots of choppy waves which the panel have all talked about and are quite right and are affecting the media industry, which I've been part of for 30 years, whether that's the Observer, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the BBC, and now with a new business. But the big trend sitting under all of this is the next generation of consumers. Now, some of them are in this room. Generation Z, and the way they are affecting the ways that we all have to operate and think are the coming trend. By 2031, they will have more economic energy in the UK and in the US than millennials. And I spent this morning with Sundar Katwala, who is the founder of Britain's Future. And they're doing a huge piece of work on Generation Z and how do they view the world and the world around them. They are far less pessimistic, Kelly. You have very kindly shared with me some of the work that you do on this next generation that is coming than we may assume. It is still true for this coming cohort that the answer to the question, when is the best time to be alive, is now. Because they are a new generation who have the side hustle, who have a way of operating that is very different. They are solutions, they are bent towards solutions. They are a group that understand that there are many different routes through careers. They are about fluidity. We are changing the whole notions of identity and who we are. And Natalie, you're absolutely right, as is Torsten. We have seen peak political chaos. And the reason for that is not just the public's exhaustion with what they have seen passing for political leadership in this country, but actually, as is true for any deficit, any country reliant on a deficit, if the markets don't like what you are doing, they will yank on your lead until you change. So by the end of next year, I feel, thinking about the three things that can keep us, in Torsten's excellent word, a little bit perky, is that inflation will be lower. We will be looking back on a year of higher stability than we have seen. I'll be interested, Torsten, on your thoughts on the fact that at the moment this is an income crisis, it is not an employment crisis. That is very, very important. And to your point, Andy, there will be lots of innovation because now I'm an entrepreneur, you never want to waste a crisis. So we have to approach it in the right way. As you say, Kathryn, there are lots of different signals about how we will consume material and how we make our way in the world. We needed a big shift. What we are in is a definite new cycle. I was business and economics editor of the Sunday Telegraph at the time of the financial crisis. And since then, we have been in a cycle of zero to negative inflation and zero interest rates. A new cycle has definitely started. We are in a period of higher inflation, not brutal inflation forever, because brutal inflation has been the effect of this year, but by the end of next year, we will be in an era of higher inflation and higher interest rates. What does that mean for the types of opportunities that will be out there? And for this new generation, as they find their voice, just a signal from America. So in America in the midterms, there was this notion of the Red Wall, that the Republicans were going to sweep the Democrats from Congress. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen for one reason, because young voters turned out and voted Democrat. Now, the gap between Democrat and Republican voting intention in the US is higher now than it was at the time of the last two elections. And what we've seen here, again from your data that you shared with us, Kelly, is that support for the Conservatives and Labour at the time of 2010 was about level pegging. If you look at those figures now, I saw one poll that put support for the Conservatives between 18 and 25 at 3%. Now, the Conservatives may have many ways of thinking about that, and as you pointed out, Kelly, there is great volatility, but there is something changing here which is really big and is the really big trend. And this generation and the generation who are going to need to think about how they change the problems we've had with productivity over the past decade, the problems we've had with flat or even declining incomes for over a decade, and looking for new solutions. And we believe in the media there is a great excitement about the opportunity to create new styles of storytelling, new ways of engaging people, new ways of creating value, both for our customers and for the talent that works for us, which is actually an enormously exciting and optimistic moment. We've almost had to rip the plaster off and seen the slight nightmare of 2022, which came out of the horrors of the COVID pandemic, which, as you say, the public have almost forgotten. The biggest economic shock since the late 1920s and 1930s. We've ripped off that plaster, and suddenly you could see, I believe, a real flourishing over next year, 2023, and beyond, as we get through this awful spike which we are going through on inflation, cost of living, which is actually a cost of inequality crisis as much as it is a cost of living crisis. And there will be great opportunities ahead as long as you focus on the trend, which is the coming generation, and not always on the choppy water, because frankly, in the choppy waves, it is absolutely exhausting.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Thank you. Okay. Right, we have lots of little questions coming through, but I wanted to give people in the room an opportunity to show your hands as well if you've got a question, and I'll take them in groups of 3. They need to be quite short and sharp questions, if that's okay. So I will take the gentleman here first. You want to go?
Yeah.
Sorry, we'll get you a microphone. Thank you.
Paul Atherton, fellow of the RSA. I would like to know from each of you...
Is it on? Sorry. Okay, try again.
No? Okay.
There you go,
there
that's
you go.
it on.
Paul Atherton, Royal Society of Arts. I would like to know from each of the panel members what they see as the kindness that they could see in their sector in 2023.
That's a lovely question. That's a lovely question. I might save that one as a final wrap-up question. And I saw a gentleman in the corner. Sorry, was there... Yeah, you got the mic. Put your hand up, sorry, again, if you had a question. Okay, fine. I'll go to this ones that we have here. Wow, there's quite a lot. Okay. Are the Conservatives doomed? Can Rishi Sunak... I'll read them out and you can literally pick what you want to respond to. How about that? Are the Conservatives doomed, or can Rishi Sunak turn it around? How does the current crisis compare to previous ones? Any lessons we can learn from other countries or previous times? Any indication at this point on the impacts on productivity arising from working from home? That's quite a selection of questions. So working from home, is Rishi Sunak literally the sub of dreams? And perhaps one about rebuilding trust in politics, which has taken quite a battering this year. We'll save the kindness one to the end, but perhaps will we start up at this end? Andy, have you any thoughts on any of those?
Yes.
Good.
I think the word crisis is overused, applied to too many things these days. But in terms of the sets of events before us, I worry rather more about where we are than I did as a result of global financial crisis. And the reason for that is Kamal just used the word sticking plaster. And there's been a liberal application of the monetary and fiscal policy sticking plasters as a way of cushioning the blows that have come thick and fast over the last 15 years or so. So, COVID crisis, it was a double dose. It was both the monetary policy and the fiscal sticking plaster. Back up a bit, global financial crisis, largely a monetary policy sticking plaster. Actually, they are and can only be sticking plaster solutions, however, because the roots of the cost of living crisis and the roots of the UK's problems cannot be resolved and will not be resolved by monetary and fiscal policy, because they shape the demand side of the economy, if you like, how much we consume, and all of our problems, with no exception, lie on the supply side of the economy, how much we produce. And that third leg of the stool, the third leg of the policy stool, not monetary, not fiscal, but if you like, structural or supply side, we so far have precious little to say, and even less has been done to tackle that bit. And that's why this particular moment in time is a particular cause of concern. On the politics of this, which I'm by no means an expert, 2 years is still quite a long time. Look how much has happened in 12 months.
Yes, indeed. So I was going to come to Natalie on the politics of it, actually. So some of the questions around, can Rishi Sunak turn it around? What can politicians do to rebuild trust? Any thoughts?
So, yes, I mean, Rishi can turn it around. I mean, obviously he has significant challenges, quite a fractious Conservative Party, but I think already his approach on some of the issues around planning and wind farms, where he has negotiated and come to a position which actually both sides seem to think is what they wanted in the first place, I think does show sort of a deafness. And also, you know, Conservatives always argued about planning. You know, we're also got to remember that, you know, politics is about argument, both between parties but also within. So I think that the signs are that he is going to, you know, and this is what I guess I was saying by the move back from individuals to issues and actually trying to come up with solutions to things. So I do think that he's already started quite well in that. In terms of trust in politics, I mean, I think probably, again, going back to some of my comments, getting on with the job. You know, people have, as I say, have kind of got a bit sick of the sort of drama going on, and you know, people have got huge issues that they're concerned about, both for themselves personally, but also other sort of broader issues facing the country, and they want to see our politicians delivering. They want to see, you know, focus on that, not on the drama in Westminster. So I think that's kind of what we will see. I think, and was kind of my optimism for next year, that we'll see much more of a focus on that than perhaps we have done over some of this year.
Thank you. And so, Torsten, we talked a little bit about the working from home trend and has stuck. And the question about productivity, what's the evidence around that?
I'm upset because I thought you were going to ask me the question that's up here on...
Which one did you want?
Well, the one where it says, how will it affect your sector if people go out less? And I was going to say, not at all, because civil servants and policy types never go out. So it doesn't, they're already there, they're just ahead of the game.
No, that one's for Kathryn.
Okay, that's good, right. Home working. Everyone gets very excited. I put home working in the bucket of everybody at the moment loves to reach for kind of either silver linings to one of the polycrises that are going on or silver bullets to solve everything. And home working is the best example, where everyone spent the 2 years during the pandemic being like, this is quite bad, because they'd got that bit, right? But don't worry, it's invented home working and it's going to solve Britain's economic geography problems, productivity problems, flexibility, lifestyle, relationships, didn't do that. All of the problems are going to get solved by this home working thing. Stepping back, and then people have very strong views, like you say. The last time I was actually in this building, in the room just along there, was with a load of chief execs from, I won't say which sector, who were basically, they were talking about the substance of their sector, but basically it was a therapy session where they were all like, let me tell you, my head office staff will not come back to the office. And I am so mad. And they're like, one after another, they were like, no, I'm even madder. And I was like, I can't help with this, people. You need a therapist for this, you don't need an economist. Anyway, but so they're all really clear productivity's down because people aren't in the office. Whereas and if you ask lots of people, they all say it's definitely brilliant, much better not being in the office, I'm so productive. Do you have any idea how productive I am in my pants? Now, my actual view, because this is all just like reaching for silver linings, is that it doesn't make that much difference to productivity. It helps on some things, writing something. It doesn't make that much difference either way. It does appear to, as my on balance reading of a lot of studies, right, that there are now are about what effect it has. I get that upsets everybody, but you know, life's hard. I think we should be perky though, because I think the evidence is pretty strong that it improves well-being, and in the end, of the people doing it, and in the end, that's quite a good thing. And if you want a bit of perkiness for the UK, if you look at what's happened, overall we've got an inactivity problem that's built up since the pandemic, but we've also seen a move of women from part-time to full-time work almost entirely driven by the fact that you can better manage the traumas that are children via hybrid working, but rather than dropping down to part-time work. And remember, once you start working part-time in Britain, your earnings profile is flat. I don't care what your employer says about how modern they are, it is flat. Okay, so the fact that if we can use hybrid working, or make the men work part-time, which is also what we need to do, but that would be illiberal. But we do need to do a bit of that. But basically, you won't deal with the gender pay gap, and so that we have seen the hybrid working does appear to be helping on that front. So better well-being, no evidence on productivity.
Very helpful, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a question to yourself, Kathryn, just on if people are going out less, what do you see as the impact on your sector? Because the word in the English dictionary, the Oxford word of the year, I believe, is something called goblin mode, which is about people sitting in their pyjamas, hunkering down, being very selfish, not going out, being a bit grim. Women, it's mostly, if you look at Goblin Mode online, it's mostly a woman, which is depicted. So I did look for some males to put up on my slides and I couldn't find them. But Goblin Mode, what's the impact on your sector? And then we'll come to you.
I don't even really want to think about the Goblin Mode thing. Well, let me just give you one word of reassurance. It's really cold, but on December the 16th, Avatar's coming out and it's 3 hours long and you can be in a warm cinema. Great. Think of all the money you'll save. I think people might be going out less, but they are going out with purpose. So it's back to my point about if you build an audience for your product, then people will come. I mean, if you look at the situation around the Taylor Swift tickets, which, you know, Taylor was forced to apologise, people will go out because they like being with other people and maybe don't like being with goblins sitting in their pyjamas. Weird. So we're in a situation, and I can only talk about cinema, which is this year we're at 80% of the admissions we had in 2019. So but before we beat ourselves up, that was a record year for cinema. Next year, and we've got 20% less product. So people will come if you're giving them what they want. So since we came back from COVID, we've had 3 of the films that have gone into the top 10. So it is that thing about, tediously, to repeat myself, it's about finding your audience and telling that audience it's on. And also, just go out, you can have a nice glass of wine in every man. It's really lovely. And
Just
also,
the everyman.
then you don't have to talk to your spouse if you've run out of things to say. So we did this very interesting thing where we said to people, you know, why would you go to the cinema? And someone said it's a really good first date because you don't have to make conversation like you do in a restaurant. It's like, okay, great.
And so, Kamal, for final comments, just that question on kindness. And actually, what do we need to be doing when we talk about kindness in 2023, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a huge and fascinating question. I think COVID taught us many things. The need for community, the need to help your neighbour, the need for intergenerational cooperation. We all had to rely on each other and on our locality in a way that we hadn't done probably for decades. And I think that as a business leader, kindness to me is around how do we think about our talent and who we employ, and it touches on this issue of flexible working and how do people work best and most productively for themselves as well as for the employer. So I think it is a really important issue, and it touches, Kelly, on this notion of diversity and the idea of equity. And we are much more driven now by this idea of fairness. And I think there is this detachment, Natalie. I think there's a little bit of evidence that politicians are starting to wake up to this, of the constant noise, the black versus white. If I don't like you, if I don't agree with you, I hate you. The confusion of some people on Twitter that they think Twitter is the world, and actually it isn't. And it is about us moving, if we're in leadership positions, moving to have a different culture about the way we work. I grew up in a media industry where there were literal punch-ups in offices, and that was seen as a pretty normal way to behave after a few hours in the pub meeting contacts. And my goodness me, I don't work in that industry anymore. Thank goodness. Still got a long way to go. There aren't so many punch-ups, thankfully. I don't always like at the Bank of England, Andy, but clearly.
Parliament.
We've all been on a journey, and I think it is really important that we remember, those of us in here in any leadership position, and that new talent that is coming through is going to demand things that my generation never demanded. And kindness, I think, is one of them. But I think it's more to the notion of well-being. People walk around with a phone in their pocket that is as powerful as the computer in their office. And so the work-life kind of differentiator for younger people is very, very different and doesn't exist in the same way. And so we have to have an approach that helps people live their life There used to be this kind of thing, wasn't there, which was, do you work to live or live to work? And I think those are things that are all amalgamated now. And if we can find the right way to approach our leadership, productivity will be affected positively. The amount of output that we create will be affected positively. In the end, for late-stage developed capitalist economies, we rely on creativity. We rely on creating great entertainment, being fantastic thinkers. And that relies on kindness. So I think you put your finger on it very, very precisely. I would say that's another reason to be optimistic for the end of 2023, because I think that it is a business necessity that we are kinder as employers, as it is for politics, as it is for every other sector of society.
Thank you very much, Kamal. So that is the end of our panel event for this evening, but I have 2 notes of optimism for 2023 before we go. One, the Ipsos Global Trends Study will be available in January. I know, you've been waiting on it. And secondly, I have champagne and canapes in the room that you just came from, so we can all go back and celebrate an awful 2022, but some degree of optimism for next year and an awful lot of kindness. So thank you all very much. Thanks to our panel.